So again, thank you everyone. My name is Gil. I work for Mellanox Technologies, and today I'm going to talk about distributed training and what we at Mellanox believe is needed to make distributed training as an efficient process, how we accelerate that. So for the first part of this presentation, I'm just going to convince you that distributed training for deep learning is important, at least for some of you. Obviously, it's not for everyone, but I'll show the cases where distributed deep learning is very important. And then I'll show what's needed to actually make distributed training work efficiently. So I hope that those who stays actually care about what I'm going to say. And with that, let's start. So it's all about big data, right? We're at the data summit, data science summit. It starts with big data. And what we call big data is actually huge data. We keep collecting huge amount of data every hour. And it's not just the cases of the pictures that we take with our cell phones. It's also sensors that are everywhere. It's cameras on the streets. It's sensors within your engines. This is an airplane engine. It's autonomous cars. All those sensors generates a huge amount of data. And with this data, we want to do things. We want to train our neural network to do something, to make sense out of the data. So to do that, what we do is develop new neural network architectures. And this is just showing some history for image recognition and voice recognition. So for image recognition, if we start with AlexNet, which is the most famous neural network used for image recognition, from 2012 AlexNet to 2016, 4 years later, with the Inception v4, the amount of computing, the compute power needed to train those networks grew 350 times by 4 years. If you look at the new processors, they are not that fast. They are not 300 times faster than what we had in 2012. If we look at voice recognition, it's not that bad, but again, in 3 years, the requirements for compute power grew 30 times. 30x more compute power required to train the new neural networks. And the reason is that the neural networks has more parameters, they are more complex, more connections between the different neurons, and it requires very heavy compute. So we have more data, okay? We generate more and more data. We have more complex neural networks, which means we require today from our processing engine much more power. And Intel or NVIDIA or other companies, they are not really able to make those processing engines that far. If we look at Moore's law, I assume you are familiar with Moore's law, predicting that CPUs will be 2 times faster every 18 months or 20 months, it depends on who you ask. So first, it was true for many years. For CPUs, it's not true anymore. GPUs with parallelism somewhat enables faster processing, but again, it's not growing fast enough. A single GPU is not good enough today for training very complex problem. If you want to run your neural network with the new data, the new neural network, what happens is that you do not get enough processing power. If you try to do this training, it will just take too long. Training a very complex problem on a single latest NVIDIA Volta GPU will take a month or a year. It depends on the problem you're trying to solve. And you cannot wait this time. You cannot afford waiting for a year to get your trained neural network. You want to solve the problem today. So the only way known today to actually do that is distribute your problem. Use multiple processing engines. Use many GPUs or CPUs or AI accelerators, AI ASIC. We don't care what this processing engine is. What we say is there is no single processing engine available today that can solve those big problems. You need to take multiple processing engines and make them work together. You need to cluster those processing engines and run your neural network training as a distributed problem on multiple processing engines. Since we don't have much time, I won't go through exactly how training works. I assume some of you are familiar, and it's easy. And for those who are not familiar, I'll just say that the way to train a neural network is to do some computation based on the current neural network and the inputs, the training set. If it's for image recognition, you just take a big amount of pictures, and you feed that into your neural network, do some processing, a very heavy processing, and what you get is a number where you can fix your parameters of the neural network to make it more accurate. And you do that many times until you get a really accurate neural network that can solve the problem you want it to solve. Can make a decision or can make a prediction. And to do that in a distributed way, there are two very common ways to do that. I'll focus on one, again, since we're limited in time. And the most common way used today is data parallelism. What happens is you take the same neural network, the same copy of the neural network, put that on multiple processing engines. And what you do is you split your input vectors. You have 20 million pictures that you want to use for training your neural network. What you do is take a portion of that and feed into one GPU and a different portion of your set of pictures and feed that into a second GPU or processing or a CPU or AI accelerator. So now you have multiple copies of your neural network. Each is being trained by different pictures, meaning each will know to do different things or get different parameters for the neural network. But you want to end up with a single neural network. That's the training processes. You don't want multiple neural networks knowing to do different things. So as a part of the process, what you need to do is take the result from each neural network. I'll try to walk away from the microphone and speak louder for a second. So you have multiple processing engines. Each of them get a part of the problem, the input set, doing some calculations, and now you need to reduce the different results into a single neural network. This operation is very common in distributed computing. It's not just common for neural network, it's true for many other distributed computing problems like high-performance computing, where you split the problem, do local calculations, and then you need to reduce the results and get a single number or a single vector or a single result. The old way to do that was to have multiple processing engines connected to your network. Let's see if it works. Connected to your network, and if you want to actually do that, you move data from one processing engine to another, wait until it resides in its memory, do some calculations, send it to another CPU or GPU and do the calculation, and the network is only responsible for moving your bytes from one memory to another memory in a different server. That was the way network used to work. We see that as a not efficient enough method to actually solve this problem. If you do that the old way, what happens is that you connect many CPUs and GPUs, you pay a lot of money for those GPUs, each one of them is running very fast, but then the part of synchronizing the results takes so long, and during that time the CPUs, GPUs, processing engines are just wasting time. So you pay a lot of money on this very expensive and fast processing engine that is busy at waiting for data instead of processing the problem. And the more GPUs or processing engines that you add, the more overheads of moving data between those processing engines that you add, and the more inefficiency. At the level that at some point, if you add another GPU, you don't gain any performance because the additional overhead is more than the additional computation power that you add. So scalability is very limited today. If you look at the science and the numbers that people are getting, we are very limited in the efficiency at large scales. We cannot actually connect many GPUs and run a very large problem at good efficiency. And this is where Mellanox is coming, and this is where I'm going to present a single technology of what we do. We do many different things, but a single technology we call in-network computing that allows you to actually do some of the processing of the data in the network. So we already said we have GPUs, they do some processing, and now they start sending data from one GPU to another. It's a waste of opportunities not to do anything within the network and just wait for the data to get to the memory of the other GPUs before you get to process it. So before I get into this technology, I want to say that, yes, I'm going to show you this in-network, very nice technology. It's not enough. You still need the speed and you need the high bandwidth to actually be able to connect those GPUs. There is a huge amount of data going between the GPUs. You need the speed within GPUs on a single server. This is why either you use a very high-speed PCI Express switch, or if you use NVIDIA GPUs, they have their proprietary protocol called NVLink that connects the GPUs in a very high bandwidth. But what I'm trying to say is, yes, bandwidth is important, it's just not good enough. Even if you add this bandwidth, and the bandwidth shows that the more bandwidth you get, the more performance you get. This is on training a VGG16 neural network, and the number of images you can feed into the training problem per second. And we show that if you add bandwidth, you get more performance. That's easy, just not enough. So what I'm going to talk about is a technology called aggregation protocol, and it's an aggregation protocol implemented into our latest switches. And the idea here is that we believe that if you have those multiple GPUs that have their local results, they need to do reduction of these results. The old way was to just move data between GPUs. But this data go through the switch anyway. The only way to get from one GPU to another is get through the switch. So what we believe is that the switch is an opportunity for you to actually do the data reduction. In case of deep neural network, all you need to do is average the different vectors from the different sources, the different GPUs. That's the operation that is needed to get the local results from each one of the GPUs and apply that on your neural network. Just averaging. It's a very simple floating point operation that very simple to implement. But if you look at the old way, you can send all the data to one GPU, do the averaging, send the result, now you get congestion. The more GPUs, the more data you are trying to feed through a single link to a single GPU. That doesn't scale. So there are different algorithms that allows you to do that. It's been public for many years now because this problem is not new, it's not just for neural networks. And probably the most common algorithm is recursive doubling, where you actually start reducing the data between pairs, compute average of different pairs, and now average of those pairs until you get the result for all your GPUs. It's a multi-step operation where you have to send data on each step between pairs of GPUs. Then you have to calculate the averaging, and then again, send data between the different GPUs. The more GPUs you have, the more steps you have. It's a log n kind of scaling, which is pretty nice, the best that exists today, as long as you implement that in the GPUs or CPUs or processing engine. What we offer is, instead of having that, we offer a new protocol, aggregation protocol, which allows you to actually do the reduction in the switch. What we did was to add floating point capabilities into the switch, so the switch now is not just moving data, it's actually able of processing data. It can do average, in this case, of the different vectors of floating points. It can do that in a very scalable way. And the nice thing about a switch is that it has a very large number of inputs, okay? That's switch. It has all the inputs connected to the different servers. It can absorb data at full wire speed, 200 gigabit per second in this case, very high speed from many ports, from many GPUs at the same time, and actually calculate the average of those vectors as they get into the switch. And if one switch is not enough for you, and you need to connect many GPUs, so you need more switches, and you build your switching fabric, and you have multiple GPUs connected to one switch, more GPUs connected to another switch. You will have the second layer of switching connecting those switches. So we have a hierarchical protocol where each switch calculates the averaging for its own local GPUs. And then the next layer of switches can actually calculate average between different switches. And we collect all this data going up the switching fabric. And by the time we get to the spine of the switching to the root of this tree, we actually have the result. And now the switches get the results back through this tree to all the GPUs. And voila, you have the results in all the GPUs, single step, you only cross the network once, very scalable because you can add more switches with more GPUs, and still it will take the same time to actually calculate, and I'll show some numbers. And during that time, the GPU is actually free to do whatever it wants. It doesn't need to handle moving data, calculating average, moving data, calculating average. It can actually process the next batch of pictures, so it can proceed with the training while data is being reduced. And actually, if you look at today's software framework, they actually support this overlap of calculating average while processing the next batch. So it allows you more efficiency, much faster and less data movement through the network. And if you look at some results, what we do here is compare hardware implementation to software implementation. This is the number of connected nodes, and this is the latency. And the interesting part here is that if you look at the hardware, it's quite flat. You add more GPUs or more nodes, more processing engines, and still the latency remains the same. Well, if you do that in software, the more nodes you have, the higher the latency, and the gap keeps growing. Here it's on a, well, it depends on how you want to count it. 128 nodes for us is small scale. The largest computer that we accelerate with this technology is actually the fastest supercomputer in the world in Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. Where they are actually connecting 27,000 GPUs on a single cluster. This is the largest and fastest computer in the world. But even in this scale, you actually see that the gap is growing between software and hardware. What you see here moving from 8 nodes to 16 nodes is we are moving from one switch to 2-layer switches, and there is an extra latency involved if you have to go through 2 switches. But then with 2-layer switches, you can get 800 switches connected, and if you go to 3 levels, you actually can connect tens of thousands of GPUs without going beyond that with latency, which is flat. Let me skip the other results. So if you look at what happens with training your neural network, the standard way is that you have your processing engines doing the processing. You actually, the old implementation of TensorFlow, the Google's neural network training infrastructure, is using parameter server, more processes to actually calculate the average. So the training processes are sending the local results into processes that are only responsible for doing the averaging and send the result back to the training processes. What we do is we actually replace those with the switch. So the switch now replaces the parameter server. You don't need a parameter server. And with just 22 GPUs, you can see that you gain the performance acceleration. This is ResNet 50 neural network training. You see that by the time, this is only connecting 22 GPUs. In my lab, that's all I had when I was doing the testing. And you see that by the time, by moving from software implementation of Allreduce running on the GPUs to doing that in the switch, you actually gain 16% more performance. And we see that the larger the number of GPUs, the larger the gap between software implementation and hardware implementation. How do you get that? If you're probably using GPU to run your training, your neural network training, NVIDIA has its own neural network, communication library called NVIDIA Collective Communication Library, or NCCL, which at first allows for moving in a single GPU. You have many processing engines communicating with the internal connectivity. If you connect multiple GPUs in a server, you have the NVLink or PCI. And the first version of this NCCL software was using, called NCCL, was designed to enable communication between GPUs on a single server. The second version of this software allowed to actually connect multiple servers with multiple GPUs using RDMA to communicate between the different processes on the different GPUs. And what we actually did was work with NVIDIA and integrate that so that the GPUs inside the node are using one protocol to communicate, but when going out of the node, they will use the switches and the aggregation protocol to actually do the aggregation. And again, looking at results, we show that at the scale we were testing, these are two different software algorithms to do the reduction, trees and ring, and I'm not going to get into the details and comparison because we don't have the time, but these are the latest algorithms used by the software engineers in NVIDIA to accelerate the communication between the GPUs. And we show that once you move that into the network, again, not because we do that better. We are not, I don't think we are smarter than the software engineers that wrote that. But because we move the processing from the end nodes, so you don't have to wait for the data and move the data more than once, into the network, we can actually get much better results. Doing things in a different location, we break the boundaries, we break the concept of doing everything in the processing engines, and network is just for moving data. And we change the way we implement things and move things into the network, and now we can accelerate that by about 2 times faster, if you just measure the bandwidth of this operation. And with that, you can actually, if you get TensorFlow with the Nickel library for NVIDIA, it will already support the acceleration of things through the Sharp protocol. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.